Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. This is our first webinar of the academic year and the first in a three-part series of talks on the topic of the US-Israel relationship. These talks will be given by the authors of three outstanding new books on the US-Israel relationship. So I hope you will join us for all of these book talks, as well as for the Nazarian Center's other online events throughout this academic year. Now I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Professor David Tal. He holds the Yossi Howell Chair in Modern Israel Studies at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. He was previously the Kahanoff Chair in Israel Studies at the University of Calgary in Canada. Professor Tal's main fields of expertise are Israel's military and diplomatic history, the US-Israel relationship, and US disarmament policy. Amazingly, he has authored about 50 articles on these subjects and 5 books. Just to name his books: Israel's Conception of Current Security, Origins and Development, which was published by Ben-Gurion University Press in 1998, War in Palestine, 1948, Strategy and Diplomacy, published by Routledge in 2004, The American Nuclear Disarmament Dilemma, 1945 to 1963, published by Syracuse University Press in 2008, and US Strategic Arms Policy in the Cold War, Negotiation and Confrontation over SALT, published by Routledge in 2017. His most recent book, his fifth, is called The Making of an Ally, The History of the US-Israel Special Relationship. It was published by Cambridge University Press this year in January and is the subject of his talk. During his presentation, you're welcome to send us questions using the Q&A box, which hopefully you should see there, and I will review these questions and select some of them to ask him during the Q&A portion of this event. So without any further ado, let me welcome Professor David Tal and turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, Dov. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be with you, well, virtually. But this is how we are doing things today. I don't know how to address the audience to say good evening or good afternoon or good day. I'll say hello, everyone. And yeah, I'm going to speak about the origins. Well, actually, the title of the book is The Origins and Development of the Israeli-American Special Relationship, but I will concentrate more about the origins. And I'll start with, in December 1962, President John F. Kennedy told Israel's Foreign Minister Golda Meir that the United States has a special relationship with Israel in the Middle East, really comparable only to that which it has with Britain. And scholars of American-Israeli relationship all agree that the relationship between Israel and the United States were and are special. The argument, the debate, is the question, since when they became special? And to discuss that, since when they became special, I would like to go back a bit to 1917. President Woodrow Wilson was the first American president to deal politically with the Zionist movement. And that happened when the British government asked him to endorse the Balfour Declaration, which was at that time, during 1917, was in the offing. After a lengthy process in which American Jewish Zionists were also involved, President Wilson granted his support to the declaration. Now, this was not obvious. Many in the United States, in the State Department, including Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, opposed the American support for the Balfour Declaration. And if you look at the map of the Middle East, certainly in 1917, it's quite obvious where the American interest lay. It certainly did not lay with the very small Zionist community that had aspirations to Palestine. It certainly laid in the Arab world. So what made Wilson to make that decision? And I would like to argue that in the relationship between Israel and the United States, there are constants and ephemeral. The constants are ideals, religion, shared values, and history. The ephemerals were interests. And in this talk, I will concentrate more on the ideals from the American side, and I'll discuss also the way Israel views the Israeli-American relationship and the core ideas that drive the Israeli attitude toward the United States. So when he made that decision, Wilson tied himself to a tradition that went back to the 17th century and to the Puritans that left mainly England and came to the New World. The rhetoric the Puritans used was biblical. They referred to themselves as the chosen people, singled out by God to be an example for all nations, just like biblical Israel. When they likened themselves to the ancient Israel, Puritans and their successors thought that the Jews should go back to their ancient homeland. From the very first settlers, explains historian Hilton Obenzinger, belief in Jewish restoration was endemic to American culture. That call was and still is based on two major undercurrents existing among the evangelical Protestant Americans, and that is relating to the religious part of the ideals that are in the base of the Israeli-American relationship. So those two undercurrents are the dispensational premillennialists and the fundamentalists. According to the dispensational premillennialists, the time when God would gather the Jewish exiles and would bring them back to their homeland in Palestine was near. The Jewish return would usher an eschatological process that would lead to the return of Jesus Christ and his 1,000-year reign. Thus, Christian salvation became dependent on the fate of the Jewish people and their return to the land God promised to them. The other religious group is the fundamentals, who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. And I would like to emphasize that on the one hand, all dispensationalists were fundamentalists, but not all fundamentalists were dispensationalists, that is, having that apocalyptic vision. The fundamentalists, for them, God's promise to Abraham, to your descendants, I will give this land, is not just a religious text, but actual political decree and historical truth that should be implemented as written. In 1985, about 40% of Americans believed in the Bible's inerrancy, and the poll made in 1996 revealed that 40% of Americans believed that God promised the land to the Jews. Believing that, and believing that God's promise to Abraham was an actual political decree, no wonder that Americans, people, and presidents could understand the Jewish claim to territories they occupied by force, even if politically they think that such occupation and hold are problematic, and that applies, of course, to the post-1967 war. A related thread in evangelical Protestantism is the view that Judaism was the source of Christianity. We are bound together by the Torah. The roots of Christianity are Jewish. We are spiritual brothers, quote unquote, declared Pastor John Hagee, the founder of Christian United for Israel, at an IPAC meeting in 2007. The Christian Zionist Brotherhood explained their link to Zionism and Israel, not in apocalyptic theology, but in mutual and conventional solidarity. The Jews are the mediators through which God's blessing is coming through to all humanity. This is to be found in Genesis 12:3. I will bless them who bless you. I will curse him who curse you. This is God talking to Israel, about Israel. It was this notion that led Senator James Inhofe, for example, the Republican from Oklahoma, to state on the Senate floor following the September 11 attacks. He said, one of the reasons God had blessed our country is because we have honored his people. One vehicle through which many American people had learned about God's promise to Abraham, that the land of Israel was giving to him and to his descendants, was the Sunday schools. In 1998, there were 164 Christian denominations listed in the National Council of Churches of Christ yearbook, with more than 73 million members. In a survey conducted in 16 of those, with more than 2 million members, it was found out that their Sunday schools contained stories about Abraham, Joshua, or both of them. And the lesson to be drawn for those stories is that Israel was the land promised by God to the Israelites. President Nixon tells in his memories that years of training in the home and church had their effect on my thinking. My parents, fundamental Quakers, had ground into me, with the aid of the church, all the fundamental ideas in their strictest interpretation, the infallibility and the literal correctness of the Bible, the miracles, all these I accepted as facts. I still believe that God is the creator, the first cause of all that exists, quote unquote. The Americans got to know the Holy Land also through geography. This came about in two forms. One was the pilgrimage literature genre, which introduced to the Americans the Holy Land. Since the mid-1800s, there was a sharp increase in the number of Americans traveling abroad, and one popular site to visit was Palestine, the Holy Land. The visits to Palestine generated accounts written by American Protestants about their pilgrimage experience. Hundreds of such accounts were published during the second half of the 19th century, introducing Palestine to the American people. Authors of books on pilgrimage to Palestine gave popular lectures to eager audience that was in the books, exposing them to Palestine's distant past, the connection between the past and present, and Palestine's past and Zionism. Stephanie Rogers summed up the impact of the pilgrimage concisely, quote, Palestine began to resemble a portal to spiritual places in the book, the Holy Land, a source of grace linking one to Christ in a way that included both political / Zionism and millennial ramifications, unquote. The Bible and its sites became alive also through the names of villages and cities across the United States. There are at least 11 villages and cities called Palestine in the United States, 24 Bethels, the biblical Bethel, 7 Bethlehem, 14 Canaan, 18 Hebron, 12 Jericho, 4 Jerusalem, and more than 50 Salem, which is a shorthand for Jerusalem, 10 Carmel, and so on. So of these, only Nazareth and Bethlehem are directly associated with the life of Jesus Christ. Israel played the religious card as much as it could and can, and the presence of Pastor Robert Jeffries at the ceremony that took place in Jerusalem in May 2018 to mark the transfer of the American embassy to Jerusalem was no coincidence. The Israeli diplomats kept close ties also with Protestants, mainly with the Evangelical Church, which is the larger among the American Christian churches, both Protestant and Catholic. It might be worth mentioning here that throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, most of the evangelical Christians believed that the return of the Jews to their land should be God's work, a way of thinking identical to that of Orthodox Jews in the sense that they were not actively pursuing that goal. Only a few believed that Christian church should actively assist the Jews to gather back in the land of Israel. However, following the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948, and even more so in the wake of Israel's territorial expansion following the June 1967 war, more and more evangelical Christians started to believe that indeed the prophecies were coming true, and they shifted their spiritual belief in the return of Jews to their homeland into an active political creed that became much more tangible during the mid-1970s. The second ideal that tied together the Americans to Israel was the shared values. The term shared values as a bond between America and Israel is unique to Israel. Americans use that term mostly in relationship to Israel. And what the shared values contain is two major elements that has to do with the American civic society, but also has a very strong religious roots. So it is democracy and individual freedom, which tied to what is called the Judeo-Christian tradition. For the Americans, democracy and individual freedom were not mere civic constructions. They were divinely ordained institutions. Consequently, when they compared their political institutions and values with those of Israel, they confirmed that the bond between the two nations were based on a divine construct. It was this kind of bond that gave a unique meaning to the shared values and to the relationship between the two nations. And I would like to relate to at least one source from which the Americans drew their core ideas about the meaning of democracy and the tie between democracy and the old scriptures, and with that, to Israel. Thomas Paine, whose house he lived a while, not far away from the place I'm staying right now. I'm speaking to you from the UK. So Thomas Way sought to justify the American War of Independence against the British rule, and especially the rebellion against the king, which was a problem. And he explained why the Americans were right and justified by God to fight against the King of England and to establish a republic, a mode of government, he argued, preferred by God. Paine ridiculed the idea that people were not equal and the right of kings and peers to stand above other people. Quote, "There is no truly natural or religious reason for the distinction of men into kings and subjects," unquote. While the Americans were fighting against the British, he argued that government by God was first introduced into the world by the heathens, from whom the children of Israel copied that custom. Paine suggested instead the lesson taught by the biblical Gideon and the prophet Samuel, who disapproved of government by kings. Until they turned to anoint a king on them, the Jewish form of government was, quote, "a kind of a republic, administered by a judge and the elders of the tribe," unquote. God was offended by the Jewish request for a king, and monarchy is ranked in scripture as one of the sins of the Jews. These were also the foundations of the idea of Judeo-Christian tradition, which represents the shared values and the common faith of Judaism and Christianity, both based and relied on the Torah, the Old Testament, and which provided the foundation of the Western civilization and American exceptionalism. Many American presidents and high-ranking officials stated repeatedly the idea and practice of that democracy tied Israel and the United States together. President Lyndon Johnson expressed that idea in the following words, quote, "Israel has become a showcase for democracy, and it is up to all believers in democracy everywhere to support Israel in every possible way," unquote. The Zionists used that rhetoric in their diplomatic campaigns. They offered to build a national home for the Jews in Palestine and to substitute the tyrannical Ottoman rule with a liberal democracy, messages that fit into Wilson's new diplomacy as well as his vision regarding the right of self-determination for national groups and the kind of political regime and constitution they should build for themselves. The other component of the shared values was the pioneer. The pioneer associated with American exceptionalism, the idea that God gave America a special role to distribute the good to the world, the idea that was also presented as the manifest destiny. And what was so special attraction to the Americans in the Jewish national movement, besides of religious meaning, was the similarities between the two nations. The settler, pioneering image of the Jewish national movement was of special attraction for the Americans. This was a theme many Americans repeated as an explanation of their sympathy and support for Israel. One example was the reception given to Prime Minister Golda Meir when she visited Milwaukee during her visit in the United States in 1969. The governor of Wisconsin, Warren P. Knowles, took pride in the fact that Meir was raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He wrote to Meir after the visit that, "You stand as an example of the courage and dedication that was motivated Wisconsinites from the pioneer days of the frontier to the present. Your role in the recreation of the Jewish state makes you a true modern-day pioneer." The governor inserted two ideas into these short sentences. First, equating between the Americans and Israeli pioneers, and second, reference to the rights of the Jews to their biblical homeland. The governor referred to the recreation of the Jewish state and not merely to the establishment of the state of Israel. Thus, the geopolitical rhetoric about the right of the Jews to Palestine led to actual advocacy for the implementation of Jewish restoration, which was endemic to American culture, as I mentioned before. Jewish history was another argument justifying the American strong attachment to Israel. During the 19th century, mainline Protestants felt guilt by Christianity's historical treatment of the Jews and the unspeakable cruelties that they had suffered at the hands of European Christians for hundreds of years. President Eisenhower, who is considered as the less friendly president toward Israel, wrote in his diary in early 1956, quote, "Israel has a very strong position in the heart and emotions of the Western world because of the tragic suffering of the Jews throughout 2,500 years of history." The Holocaust only strengthened that sentiment. This was a sensitive issue mainly among Protestants. Because of the intellectual leadership the German Protestant Church provided to the American Protestant Church, the passive support of the German Protestant Church and its followers of the Nazi rule deeply shocked American Protestants. In 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, Reinhold Niebuhr called for the settlement of Jews in Palestine after the war. He described it as the democratic world's duty. President Truman was, of course, horrified by the Holocaust, his words, and President Jimmy Carter stated that memories of the Holocaust are still alive. There is a sympathy and some guilt because of the incredible silence in Washington during Hitler's persecution of the European Jews, quote unquote. Ronald Reagan was just as much committed. The Holocaust, he said, I believe, left America with a moral responsibility to ensure that what happened to the Jews under Hitler never happens again. We must not let it happen again. The civilized world owed that to the people who were the greatest victims of Hitler's madness. Israeli leaders, on their part, did not hesitate to use the Holocaust as a reminder and a reason for the United States support for Israel. David Ben-Gurion would reiterate this theme time and again in his contacts with various American presidents. In a letter he sent to President John F. Kennedy in June 1962, Ben-Gurion justified Israel's request for arms in the following argument. We are confronted with a unique security problem. It is not our democratic system or our borders and independence alone which are threatened, but our very physical existence is at stake. What was done to 6 million of our brethren 20 years ago could be done to the 2 million Jews of Israel if, God forbid, the IDF are defeated. For these reasons, it is of utmost importance to provide the IDF with sufficient deterrent strength which will prevent our neighbors from making war on us. So religion, values, and history, shared values, seem to put the United States on a predetermined course in its attitude toward Israel. But can we say the same thing about Israel's association with the United States? Was it only natural for Israel to seek a special relationship with the United States, or was it a matter of convenience and expediency, with Israel wishing to rely on the strongest power in the world? The truth of the matter is that unlike the nature of US foreign policy, the Zionist and Israel's foreign policy was more pragmatic and realistic than ideological. From the very first day of its existence, the Zionist leaders attributed high importance to the support of a great power in the Zionist project. Benjamin Herzl tried and failed to recruit the Ottoman Empire and later the German Wilhelm II to the Zionist cause. The Zionists were more successful in their attempt to recruit Britain. One major result of that was the Balfour Declaration, and later, when it was given mandate over Palestine, the British practically acted to carry out the obligation they made in the Balfour Declaration. However, the British chapter in the history of the Zionist movement ended in May 1939, when the British government published a white paper that set very strict limits on the immigration of Jews to Palestine and limited significantly the ability of Jews in Palestine to purchase land, mainly from the Arabs, which basically meant that the British withdrew from the commitment they made in the Balfour Declaration. The Zionist movement sought now a new ally, and the natural alternative was the United States. However, the Zionists and the State of Israel did not appreciate the links with the United States because of Americans' moral standing and values. It was the Jewish community and the way American political institutions could be used to advance Zionist and Israel interests that led the Zionists and the Israeli leaders to seek the support of the United States. David Ben-Gurion appreciated highly the American political system, which gave power to public opinion. David Ben-Gurion stayed from 1915 up to 1945. Many times he spent a lot of time in the United States. He studied the American institutions, he studied the American political system, and his studies, which he made mainly during the first three years of his stay in the United States, from 1915 to 1918, all that led him to believe in the power of the American political system and the place of public opinion within that. And to understand David Ben-Gurion's attitude toward the United States, we need to look at it first in the broader context of his view of the world and its relations with Israel. David Ben-Gurion believed that the Jewish people were unique in the sense that they were alone in the world, a people who dwell alone. Am lebadad yishkon. Throughout history, the Jewish nation was singular in its language, religion, culture, and standing in the world. In all generations, said Ben-Gurion, in all countries, and in all circumstances, we dwell alone, and we will continue dwelling alone until the end of generations. This is the central and most crucial fact of the history of the Jewish people. And it is still the determining fact that decided today Israel's security and policy. We have only one ally, the Jewish people in the diaspora. Along these lines, in October 1941, David Ben-Gurion declared, quote, he put no faith in princes, neither in Churchill, nor in Roosevelt, nor in any other Gentile leader or party or country. In it, Ben-Gurion saw the Jewish community in the United States as the hinterland of Israel and one of its most profound assets. And he repeated that theme in July 1955 when he stated, the Jewish community in the United States is Israel's only and true ally. The American political system allowed the American Jews to become a strong power that could help Israel at time of need. Quote, their power was not only in their identification with Israel, but more so due to their ability to exert political power on behalf of Israel, unquote. And Jews, argued Ben-Gurion, should exercise that power whenever Israel was in need of help. David Ben-Gurion made clear how he viewed the nature of Israel's foreign policy in the Knesset in November 1951, when he said, the point of departure of Israel's policy is not our attitude toward the ideology of that country or another, but only on the basis of Israel's core values and present and historical needs. And that was where the American Jews fit in. Israel sought to base its relations with the United States on interests. That realistic approach to foreign policy led the Israelis to believe the Israelis did not really, it's not only that the Israelis did not appreciate the American values, they did not really understand the power of the American values and the power of the American association with Israel, which was based on these values. So the Israeli believed that the only way by which Israel could be an ally of the United States would be if the United States would treat Israel as a strategic ally. Assuming that the relationship between these two states would be stronger if based on interests, Israelis act to persuade American administration that Israel could serve American regional, military, and strategic goals better than the Arabs. And that happened mainly in the 1950s and 1960s. Convincing the Americans that this was the case was a laborious task, but it eventually succeeded. The success was the result of two developments. First, Israel insisted that it could serve American strategic interests and acted to prove that time and again. And the most conspicuous example to where Israel presented to the United States its strategic value, one of the first cases, was when Israel managed to get hold of the in February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a speech in the Kremlin in which he basically denounced Stalin's crimes. And the protocol of that meeting reached into the Israeli intelligence organs, and the Mossad gave the transcript to the CIA, who leaked the transcript to the New York Times. And that was one example to what became a gradual process of cooperation between the Israeli and the American intelligence branches, which later developed into much more comprehensive strategic cooperation between Israel and the United States. The second factor that changed or made Israel of strategic values to the United States was the realization by American presidents, which happened gradually, that the Cold War was taking place also in the Middle East, and the region was divided into two. Essentially, since 1958, Israel was perceived part of the Western camp in the region, although it was only President Carter who was the first to publicly acknowledge that this was the case. Another venue for the deepening of the strategic relationship was the Israeli achievements in war against Soviet weapons. That happened in 1967, it happened in 1973, and it happened in 1982. And the Americans came to learn the lessons. They came to Israel and they started to study the lessons of the war, and they studied the lessons of the weapons, the Soviet weapons that Israel got hold on during those wars. And gradually, the Americans changed their mind about Israel's value as a strategic ally. However, Israel's strategic importance was not the reason for the special relationship between Israel and the United States, but its outcome. In other words, the existence and endurance of those relationships was not and is not determined by strategic interests. It was decided by and based on the constants, on the values. The special relationships were embedded within the way the Americans understood Zionism and the State of Israel. The result was openness and intimacy that only deepened with time. Direct communications between Israelis' head of states, their lieutenants and diplomats, and with their American counterparts was part of that sense of special relationship, which gradually and with time became also strategic partnership and conflict of interests. The forces that drove American attitude toward Israel, religions, shared values, and history, laid the ground for an open door through which Israeli and American high-ranking officials talked with each other with no hindrance. They would listen to each other, allowing the other to convince them. These exchanges also affected policy, as the nature of this relationship between the two countries were decided not in Washington alone. It was a mutual process where the voices and interests of both countries were considered and measured. Naturally, there were also arguments and disagreements over policy. However, religion, shared values, and history were the three pillars and bedrock upon which interests were weighted, and dialogue would flourish. The interests of each country not always aligned, but they were superseded by the constants, or at least became a matter of discussion and negotiation, which Israel and the United States could have in such an intimate manner. Does it all mean that the American-Israeli relationship will continue to remain special also in the future? Probably. One thing I can promise you, if that won't be the case, I'll know how to explain that too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I'm sure people have lots of questions. So I want to encourage everybody in the audience to send in your questions using the Q&A box, and I will pick some of those questions to ask Professor Tal. But as the moderator for today's event, I have the privilege of being the first to ask a question. And I want to always, so my first question, it's always a question I have whenever anybody writes a book. I'm working on one now, and I often wonder why I'm doing this. What drives a person to spend years of their life, immersed in the subject and writing this book? So I want to ask you why you wrote the book. I mean, in particular, because, the US-Israel relationship isn't a subject that hasn't been written about before. There are lots of books already about this relationship, and particularly focusing on particular presidents and the role that they've played, whether it was Eisenhower or Kennedy or Johnson. So, what's different? Why did you think that your approach was different? What did you think is missing, if you like, in the existing literature? How does this book in particular differ?
Yeah, thank you very much, though, for this question. Really, it takes us a bit further from the main body of my lecture, and I say that for good. It's good, in a way that you really allow me really to reflect on what I did. I'm studying, I think the first article I wrote about the Israel-American relationship was published, I think it was in 1995, give or take. And my approach, and since then I wrote, I think about 6 or 7 articles on various aspects of the Israel-American relationship. And the dominant feature of these articles was describing the relationship between the two states based on state-to-state relationship. That is how the relationships were conducted between head of states, diplomats, with their peers on Israeli and American side. And gradually, I came to ask and to answer questions relating to, first, the nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States, because the existing literature, the vast majority of the existing literature describe the relationship in terms of, I would say brutally, to put it brutally, it was described as patron-client relationship. That is, there is one great power, small country, and it's quite obvious where the flow of influence goes. And that is not the case. I learned that that is not the case. And actually, there was a lot of mutuality. And that brings me to the second aspect that I think that this book is unique in a way. And that is part of the approach of most of the literature of American-Israeli relationship is the result of the nature of the sources used by those who wrote about the American-Israeli relationship. I would say the vast majority, because I don't want to say, there are very, very few exceptional books, but the vast majority of those books rely on American sources. And that gives you not only the American perspective alone, it gives you also the American point of view, and in a way it reflects also an attitude. If you assume that the American documents are the important documents and the Israeli are not, it's not only dedicate or decide the nature of your query, it also decides your attitude and approach. And this book, and I started to do that in my articles before that, are based on sources, Israeli and American sources. And that allowed me to show how the relationship were much more mutual and equal. And as I said, I said that in one sentence, but that sentence really contains it all. Decisions and policy were made about the relationship between these two states were made not only between in Washington. Those were made in Washington and in Jerusalem through mutual discussions, through mutual cooperations, arguments, and debates in which both representatives of those countries took place. So that is one thing that I think that the book is really is new about. But the second thing, which I really, is really the combination with much more emphasis on ideals, but the combination between ideals and interests. Now, I didn't really talk a lot about interest for, well, I asked you to give me 3 hours, but you didn't want to give me 3 hours. You give me
Next
only
time.
40. So I spent really the time speaking about what I think, but this is the point. The roots of the relationship are those constants. But there are interests, and we need to view all of this together. This is the Israeli-American relationship are based on ideas, ideals, and on interests. And when we speak about interests, they're not only interests in the sense that Israel provide information, intelligence, or whatever it is. American interests in Israel, or the interest that Israel represents in the United States, is also the values of the United States. It is the interest of the United States, for example, to advance policy that is based on democracy. And it is, we call that soft power, right? So the soft power, that is, when we speak about interest, we can't measure interest only in coins, in hard coin. The values, the American values, they are part of what the Americans view as their interests. And another element, which I completely did not discuss today, but is in the book, and I think that this is also part of what is new in the book, and that is the fact that I talk about strategic interest and I talk about the values, but the American-Israeli relationship has much more into it. It's about cultural exchanges. It's about economic exchanges. And economic exchanges, not only in terms of aid and economic assistance, which was part of the whole thing, but there are shared interests which are economic. And there are, as I said, exchange of culture. And there are books and translations of books and the transfer of knowledge between the two communities. Just one example, just recently, the Technion cooperated with Cornell University to establish a new campus in New York, in Manhattan, where they tried to build a kind of a new Silicon Valley in New York through this cooperation between the Technion and the Cornell. But that cooperation between two academic institutions represent a much broader approach to science, for example, an exchange in science between Israel and the United States. So essentially, when we speak about a special relationship, that encompasses almost every aspect of life that you can think about. And well, I didn't really put too much detail into that for lack of space, but basically that is the attitude of the book, which I think makes the book a bit different from what you can find on the shelves.
Absolutely. I just want to, just to follow up on that, I think, so this question of, the role of interests versus values, or kind of a realist approach to understanding that, to explaining this relationship versus what you characterize as an idealist approach, one that emphasizes the role of beliefs and ideas. Now, to present the counter, the realist, the counter argument, and this is maybe something for, as the historian, they would often emphasize the fact that this relationship, or really the strategic relationship, really emerges after 1967, after Israel's proven itself as a strategic asset. And in fact, the president who probably did more to solidify that special relation, that strategic relationship, was Richard Nixon, who was an anti-Semite, among other things. So not necessarily somebody who had a wonderful view about Judeo-Christian. So, what's your response to that? Is it more about how you periodize? Significantly, your book begins the story of this relationship decades earlier than I think many others tend to do, which tend to focus it much more in the 1950s or even 1960s.
And this is the point, really. And you are absolutely right in you are describing the current approach among many historians and IR scholars to the Israeli-American relationship. I'll take you back to the point that I made in the beginning of my talk. How can you explain Wilson's decision to support an idea that went profoundly against American interests? Or let's go back to August 1946. In August 1946, President Truman was presented with the idea of a Jewish state, which will be based on partition. And that idea was introduced to him by the Jewish Agency through Undersecretary Acheson. And at that point, President Truman said, as against the very strong opposition of George Marshall and other State Department officials, and he decided to support the idea of a Jewish state. Why would he do that? It goes against the very interest of the United States. Why, in May 12, 1948, President Truman rejected George Marshall's demand, very hard demand, not to grant recognition to the new state of Israel? Why would he do that? Interest cannot explain that. Interest cannot explain the support, the American support for Israel in the 1950s. In the 1950s, and that's the special relationship were manifested in the 1950s, for example, through the special treatment that Israel got when it asked for financial aid. The Americans gave financial aid and they tried to place it or to make it a kind of a universal plan, but it was not. And Israel got special treatment. How can you explain that? Certainly in the 1950s, there was no interest that Israel could provide to the United States. And I think that the only explanation, the only way to explain the strength, I would say, and the longevity of the American-Israeli relationship is by basing it on ideals. And I think that if you read the book, you can see how, and again, in our talk now, I'm making just, brief points and bullet points. But in the book, I show how that was a systematic process that went through from 1917 through all the years, and it happened at every juncture where there was a conflict between interest and ideals, and Israel's security was on line. The United States sacrificed its interest, and it did so because of the ideals.
So, I mean, in a way, you seem to imply that the State Department was right, in a sense, in opposing partition, right? We have a question from Gary Gilbert about that, who asks, given how would you explain then the opposition to Zionism and to Israel found in the State Department and in other parts of the US government? I mean, essentially, do you think that they were promoting what they saw as Americanism? And it seems in the book, you argue on a number of occasions that the US support for Israel doesn't serve American interests.
Yeah, well, the reason, I think that the major reason, there is always, of course, the argument about the anti-Semitism of the State Department.
That was my next question.
Yeah, but the point is that, and certainly that was the case before the establishment of the State of Israel. If you take, but that happened also after, by the way. If you take the average American diplomat, if you look at his career, then he would serve usually much more in Arab states rather than serving in Israel. And while serving in Arab states, he would learn the Arab point of view, and he would become a kind of an ambassador of the Arab state. And then he would, so in his reports, and we can see that in many cases. If you look at the documents, you will see how the American ambassador in Cairo became a kind of a messenger for the Egyptian message, And he comes back then, so he serves in Iraq, and he serves in Syria, and he serves in Egypt, and then he comes back to Washington to the State Department, and he became an official in the State Department. And now he knows and he views the Middle East in a much broader manner, and he sees things that for the president are less significant, are less important in the sense that they are much less educated about those issues. For the president, it's his worldview that directs him. The diplomat, it is the reality that he sees that directs him. And that is the reason for the conflict, the reason for the difference of opinion.
So you don't think anti-Semitism then had any, I had to ask.
No,
you don't think that has a significant role to play in general? Has that played any, whether it's in the, the views of some of the so-called Arabists in the State Department, or more broadly in terms of US policy? I mean, does it matter that Nixon was anti-Semitic? Does it matter?
Dov, I must say,
Semitic?
Yeah, I must say, I deal with that in the book with Nixon's anti-Semitic comments. And my argument is that Nixon was not a racial anti-Semitic. Nixon had bad mouth. He had foul mouth. He used words that I can't repeat here. Usually in TV, if I use the words, it will be bips, right? That was the way he spoke. That was the way he articulated himself. His anti-Semitic comments were just as the F word. It has nothing to do with his attitude toward Jews in general. He admired Golda Meir. He admired Jews. Well, Kissinger was his closest advisor. He treated him the way he did, but basically he was, and there were other Jews in his administration. So his anti-Semitism was not racialized anti-Semitism in the sense that a kind of an Aryan supremacy. It was a manner of speaking, bad language, foul mouth, and that was it.
And stereotypes, much like President Trump.
Yes, yeah. I think that there is kind of a distinction between the Jew and the Israelis, I think. But I won't go too deep into that.
That's an interesting distinction, maybe a subject for your next book. So there's a lot of, quite a few questions have come in, about this argument about shared values. So I want to try and, read a couple of the questions that have come in, and then, put it within a broader framework. First of all, a question from my good friend, former co-author Ilan Peleg, who asks, whether those shared values that you've emphasized might be challenged by Israel's continuing occupation of the West Bank, by the passage in 2018 of the nation state law. I mean, in other words, I think is that structure of shared values that you've emphasized as being so important, is that shifting? You present shared values as constants, but in fact, values aren't fixed. Values change, albeit slowly. We may be seeing in both societies a shift in values. So Eli Saltzman and Jonathan Goldberg both have sent in the same, more or less the same question, pointing to the possible inclusion of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Kahanist, in the next Israeli government. If Netanyahu is able to form that government, Ben-Gvir will become most likely a minister. Doesn't that underlie the fact that really there aren't these shared values, or at least they are dissipating? And if so, I'll add, does that then suggest that given the role that shared values play for you in this relationship, that in fact the future of the relationship is more troubled than you suggested at the end of your talk?
No, the end of my talk, and I must say that, I'll repeat, and I'll say that again. Does it all mean that American-Israeli relationship will continue to remain special in the future? Probably. One thing I can promise you, I said, if that won't be the case, I'll know how to explain it. So the point is, and again, I must say that I really enjoy my position as historian in the sense that all I need is to predict the past. Thanks God, I don't need to predict the future. Now, I agree with you completely, and I write it in the book that these constants, they are not stone, carved on stone. They can change, absolutely. The fact is that up to this point, these values, these constants were as strong and significant in the making of the Israeli-American relationship. Can that change? Of course it can be changed. It's not something that came up from God above. But I think that the point of change now, and it's very difficult to go into specifics. You can always come up with a scenario, and I'll come up with my scenario, and we can basically engage in kind of games that I have the answer for any question that you might have. I think that the point is that if you take, broadly speaking, the American attitude toward the occupied territories, for example, generally speaking, there is much more understanding, or at least a favorable view of the Israeli hold of the occupied territories as against those who oppose that, for also religious reasons, because people believe that this is these parts of the land supposed to be part of Israel, and and those who believe to the Israeli narrative according to which there is no one to speak with about peace. And you don't see major shifts in that. You might see, I don't know. And if the shift will happen, then yeah, so the next book will be the breakup of the Israeli-American special relationship.
So I want to put also, continuous this focus on values, the kind of, I guess this would be the question that maybe somebody from the kind of radical left might pose. And they might argue that, what about the real values that underpin this relationship aren't necessarily the positive values of democracy and freedom and rights, but rather Islamophobia and or Orientalism. In other words, the fact, going back to your comment you just made, that the Americans might look more kindly upon Israel's 55-year occupation of the West Bank, is that because in both societies there is a sense that Muslims are potentially violent, can't be trusted, that Palestinians are terrorists, etc. In other words, the values are ones based upon a kind of erasure of the Palestinian presence.
Yeah. Well, my answer will be first to these left-wing guys. I say, please go and buy my book, because I address that question in the book. And my answer is, it is not or, it is and. I didn't mention Orientalism, but I certainly speak in the book about Orientalism. Yes, absolutely. Orientalism is part of the bond that ties together Israel and the United States. Absolutely. The war against terror. What is the war against terror? It is, you can also take that and translate that into Islamophobia, and it is certainly part of it. Yeah, it's no argument about that. The only reservation I have is that don't do that or, it is and. It is shared values, democracy, history, religion, Islamophobia, Orientalism, absolutely.
So we have to talk about the role of the pro-Israel lobby. Any discussion of the US-Israel relationship, can't take place without that coming up. And, you've heard all the kind of conspiracy theories or claims that it's really, the lobby and the power of the lobby and AIPAC in particular, that is the driving force behind this special relationship, and their ability to kind of, terrorize politicians who might challenge this relationship, or, a bit more seriously, at least get them defeated. And many people, commentators have pointed just the most recent round of primaries, seeing, AIPAC perhaps kind of defeat critics of the US-Israel special relationship. So what's your take on that? I mean, what role do you give does it have an independent role to play in this relationship? Or is it really, a kind of almost an anti-Semitic myth that the lobby has played this outside role?
Well, I'll dwell on your last comment on the anti-Semitic aspect, because it's interesting, because what we have here, and in a minute I'll go a bit more detail, but what is interesting, this anti-Semitic myth is actually nourished not only by the anti-Semitics, ostensibly, but also by the Jews. The Jews, certainly, there is a conflict, and you should know that more than even me, certainly, but you should know that we know that on the one hand, if you say Jewish vote, the Jews would revolt. Right. But on the other hand, they based all their political activity on the idea of the Jewish vote. So there is kind of the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's kind of, it's a yes and no.
Right. And it serves Zionism in terms of getting support for the Balfour Declaration.
Exactly. It's kind of the idea, we have the power, but don't say that we have the power.
We can say it, you can't.
Exactly, exactly. Now, as to the subject itself. No, I don't think that the Jewish lobby has the power to change American policy. First, because it's unnecessary. You don't have really. Now, on the one hand, you don't have really, for example, a contestant to presidency who was anti-Israeli. The presidents are pro-Israelis because of the reasons that I just outlined. They are what they are. And that applies also to congressmen and it applies to governors and other officials. On the other hand, there were anti-Israeli congressmen, take Fulbright, and he did well. He did well, he succeeded despite, I think that those who were defeated, they had a very good excuse. Oh, it's the Jewish lobby. But basically, you have now the trio. What her name? The three ladies.
The so-called squad. You mean Rashida?
Yeah, they are in Congress. Right. They are anti-Israeli. They are anti-Israeli lobby, and they are in Congress, right? So essentially, I think that the level or the number of anti-Israeli congressmen, as against the pro-Israeli, reflect the American attitude toward Israel. We speak usually in terms of, oh, the president succumb or agree or whatever it is to the Jewish lobby, but it is not. The thing is that the American president is part of the public opinion. He's not standing against public opinion. So, and the American public opinion, by and large, is pro-Israeli. And you can find that so in the White House, you can find that in Congress. So the Jewish lobby, essentially, the main role, I think, of the Jewish lobby and the main impact is not in dictating policy, but to pointing to issues, to show or to talk about, because there were enough cases where the Jewish lobby was defeated by Congress and by presidents. But the Jewish lobby role basically is to point to, look, we need to address that issue. And Congress would say, oh, okay, I didn't think about that, that we should do it. So that, I think, is the main force and power of
agenda setting.
Not in making policy, but in pointing toward what they think is necessary.
What about, you know, the so-called the oil lobby? I mean, you don't discuss that.
Yeah.
Is that because really you don't really think the Arab lobby, the oil lobby has played even exists or has played much of a role? I mean, I think, given American oil, I mean, like today, you know, there's a lot of focus on how the United States doesn't have the ability very much to have much influence in the global oil market. But, you know, historically, US oil companies heavily invested in the region, right? And we often think about the role that economic lobbies play in US politics in general. Why not? Why is the oil lobby?
Yeah. Because I think that essentially we don't see, basically, we all know that American policy is pro-Israeli. So there is no really pro-Arab lobby with any impact. And once again, the thing is not the impact of the lobby, because the president, the congressman, the government, they don't need the lobby to think about policy. This is what they do because they believe in that. Now, I don't know, George Shultz, when he became, George Shultz has a past with oil company, right? He was some Saudi Arabia associated company.
And many other,
yeah. He was one of the most pro-Israeli Secretary of State. I think that, again, the oil lobby is once again, is a kind of an answer to a question that was never asked or never was supposed to ask. It's kind of an excuse, but essentially it never really played a significant role because the Americans, as I said, essentially are pro-Israelis. That is, I would say, is the main reason for the lack of significant influence. And again, the influence is only a reflection of the place of Israel in the United States and not the outcome of that activity.
So one question's come in about you've emphasized the role that religion played, Christianity particularly, and evangelical Christianity and dispensationalism. What about the mainline, not the evangelicals, but mainline Protestants? What we've seen over the last, few decades really is a shift away from supporting Israel toward a more critical or pro-Palestinian position. I mean, some of the mainline Protestant parties have passed BDS resolutions, for example. How do you see that this shift taking place?
There's no shift. Until the 1970s, the main political power, Christian political power, was the mainline Protestants. Now, it was among those missionaries, for example, in 1917, who recommended strongly to Eisenhower not to endorse the Balfour Declaration. And throughout the years, the mainstream Protestant church was not pro-Israeli. It not always was anti-Israeli, but it was not pro-Israeli. And that happened time and again. And the change took place in the 1970s with the decline of the power of the mainstream Christianity, Protestant Christianity, in terms of audience, in terms of participation of the American public in the activities of the mainline Protestants, and the shift toward the evangelicals. The evangelical churches became bigger, richer, they spread much more, and they are the majority of Christianity in the United States. So the mainline churches, they have, of course, still their influence, their impact, but they are in the minority. So their impact on at least the public discourse is far minor as compared to the evangelicals, who are really leading and very growing political power in the United States.
Fascinating. So I want to ask, I'm British, you live in the UK. People in Britain like to talk about the US, the special relationship between the US and the United Kingdom. And you opened your presentation by referring to that relationship. Is the US-Israel special relationship unique? Is it, the only comparison that you made is between the US and the UK. But I wonder, whether the US-Israel relationship goes even beyond that. I mean, at the end of the day, the US-UK relationship, while, there's lots of talk about, historic ties and special relationship, the US doesn't give the UK a great deal, if anything, right? I mean, it's not like there's a huge amount of American largesse towards the United Kingdom compared to the decades of American largesse, financial, military, diplomatic, toward Israel. So do you think, from your vantage point in the UK, do you see these two things as similar, or actually maybe the US-Israel relationship is truly the only special relationship?
Yeah. It's interesting because that is, I'm teaching now a module on Israeli-American relationship, and that was exactly the subject of my last class on Tuesday, the special relation, the idea, the concept of special relationship. And the answer to that is, I think that what distinguishes really the Israeli-American special relationship are two things. First, as I said, they are based really on the constants, on ideals. And that leads to the second special feature, and that is the longevity of those relationships. You don't have any other country with which the United States has what you may term special relationship to such an extent of time. You don't have that. Even with the, as to the US-British relationship, scholars argue that those relationships exist only from the British part of the equation. The United States, they even don't know that they have special relationship with the UK, or the common phrase that they are separated by common language. But essentially, really, and we need to remember, although the American ties or the American roots are in Britain, but these roots basically were severed by the Americans who came from Britain. It was not that they brought the heritage of Britain to America. They severed their ties. Yes. Yeah, but in the case of Israel, it is exactly the opposite. The Americans say that they draw their values from the well of the old scriptures. So I think that what makes the Israeli-American special, not the common interests. Interests can change, and they change all the time, and there are arguments about interests. What really makes those relationships special is the fact that they last so long, and they are based on core ideas that you can find since even before 1917. And they are in use in a way until this very day. And American officials repeatedly said, look, we have arguments, but we have special relationship. And this is why we can argue, we can get into conflicts, but at the end of the day, we have special relationship, and that gives us a common ground over which we can make all these arguments, arrangements, and solutions.
So my final question, you've made the point that on the US side, they've focused on these values, they've emphasized these shared values, and they've really believed in them. It's a sincere thing. Whereas on the Israeli side, and you quoted Ben Gurion, the focus has been on interests, and they've tended to adopt a less romantic and rosy-eyed view of this relationship, and one much more grounded in kind of pragmatism or realism, if you like. Do you think that difference, that the two sides, that one side kind of emphasizing values or idealism and the other realism, does that reflect a broader difference in American and Israeli foreign policy? That American foreign policy, not just toward Israel, but idealism is the kind of a guiding theme of a US foreign policy, while realism and a very kind of hawkish realism, hard-nosed realism, has always been the driving force of Israel. So is it ultimately derivative of these deeper?
Yeah, no, there is no, in my mind at least, there is no question about that. It is the kind of the Wilsonian vision of the manifest destiny, the idea that the America has a mission. And that mission, which I liked very much, you have Robert Kagan book, The Dangerous Nation. Why it is dangerous? Because it brings its values and it shove it into your throat if you won't accept it willingly. And the United States has that, and we can see that, well, until this very day, almost. We can see how the United States is determined to share and to push its values. It's not really about interests. It's about values. Now, of course, always you can say, well, these values are a cover. The United States went to Iraq, not really for values, it went for the oil. You always can find that, and I'm not sure if one should exclude the other. Right. But certainly the driving force of American policy, and again, I do that in a very brief way, in a very kind of, very bold way. But I think that all in all, American foreign policy is driven by ideals. It put the United States into a lot of trouble. And the American attitude toward Israel is part of it, and the result of that profound attitude of missionary, of manifest destiny, of bringing to the world the glory and the message of the American greatness.
Absolutely, and I think
which does not exist, of course, in the case of Israel.
Which may help explain why I think there's a kind of an underlying anxiety among Israelis, at least Israeli policymakers, that the United States will betray Israel because they don't quite trust these values. And we see it today over the ongoing long-running debate over Iran and the nuclear agreement, like that fear that America will follow its interests and we're going to be left alone in the world. Absolutely.
And again, as I said, the Israelis did not really appreciate the power of the American values-based attachment toward Israel. They don't really understand that. They don't really appreciate that. They don't see the power of it. And this is why you are absolutely right. There is always the fear that there will be some interest that will supersede Israeli-American interest, and the United States would abandon. And the case of Taiwan, by example, might ring kind of a warning sign. But of course, the case is completely different. And the values, I believe, at least up to this point, the values are still very strong and very binding in terms of American foreign policy toward Israel.
So I think certainly we have to recommend your book to Yair Lapid and Netanyahu and any Israeli diplomat to understand, what's really at the root of this relationship and what it's.
Please do that.
Absolutely. If you're watching Prime Minister Lapid, read Professor Tal's book, and to everyone in the audience, I hope this webinar has encouraged you to go out and read this excellent book. It really does, as I think, hopefully you've got a taste in this webinar, really does, I think, provide a deep and nuanced analysis of the sources of this very critical relationship. So I want to thank you, Professor Tal, for joining us. I want to thank very much, our audience. I want to remind everybody that this webinar will also be posted on the Nazarian Center's website and on our YouTube channel. So please let your friends and family know, share it widely. And I hope you will all come again for our next webinar, which will be taking place next month, when I will be joined by Israeli pollster and political analyst Dalia Shenlin on November the 9th, and we will analyze the results of Israel's election. So I hope to see you all then. Thank you again, Professor Tal, for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much, Dov.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Goodbye.